Thank you very much for joining in. Very warm welcome to the workshop with the ambitious agenda on European industry digitalization, making best practice a reality. So I am Egidijus Barcevičius. I am from PPMI, which is a public policy research center. And so during this year, our company, together with a number of digital innovation hubs, as well as some academics from across the Europe, so we've been undertaking research on issues, on practices, what concerns digitalization in European industry. So today we are going to present some of the findings from this research. However, well, European Commission was also very much a driving force behind our research and behind the workshop today. So before we kickstart the actual agenda, I would also like to ask Heidi Cigan from European Commission from DG Connect to also say a few welcoming words. So Heidi, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So I'm very pleased to welcome you this morning on the side of the European Commission to our workshop today on European industry digitalization, making best practice a reality. So this workshop forms part of an ongoing study on smart industrial remoting being carried out by PPMI on behalf of the European Commission. And the goal of the study is to develop targeted advice in the form of a set of toolboxes on digitalization for 5 sectors in 5 EU countries that have a particularly low level of digital intensity and which have also been quite hard hit by the COVID pandemic. So after having carried out a gap analysis and identified the main digitalization problems faced by the selected industries in the countries concerned, in this stage of the project, information on digitalization best practices has been gathered and analysed to develop a set of best practice principles. While the next steps of the study will include the implementation of a set of digitalization experiments in actual companies, followed by the development of the toolboxes, today we want to discuss these best practice principles developed through the study. And in particular, our objectives are firstly to share with you the insights that have been gathered regarding the industry digitalization best practices. Secondly, to discuss how SMEs can advance in their digitalization journeys and apply best practices in reality. And then finally, to validate and gather additional experiences concerning digitalization best practices from the participants here today. And I'm very happy to see that we have a good mix of participants here today who can both contribute to this discussion and I think as well benefit from it, including, for example, a number of digital innovation hubs who are also working to support digitalization, business digitalization in Europe, also together with the Commission, with the support of the Commission. And I will come back to this later in my intervention a little bit later. But for now, I will pass the floor back to the colleagues at PPMI who will lead you through today's proceedings. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the workshop today.
Okay, thank you so much, Heidi. And actually now it's the time to check your phones, but I don't really mean checking the email. Actually, I would like you to actually go to menti.com because we'll very much like to see who is present in this workshop today. So please go to menti.com. There is a code written on the slide, so it's 76770436. And so we'll see what kind of organizations are present in this workshop. Okay, so the information is coming in. We see a mix of digital innovation hubs, research academia, We see some participants from businesses, from the public sector.
Sorry, could you share the code again?
So the code, let's check it out. Okay, so the code is actually on the top of the screen. So
Okay,
it's 776770436.
Thanks.
So let's wait for a few more seconds. Okay, but the tendency is pretty clear. So there is indeed a mix of people from digital innovation hubs, from research, from public sector, from businesses as well. We are very happy also to have businesses present here. So thank you very much again for taking part. And so probably we can move on to our further slides. And so we'd like to again mention that so the research which is being presented here has been carried out by our colleagues here at PPMI, but also with the involvement of digital innovation hubs from Lithuania, Hungary, Portugal, Romania, Poland, and also a number of academics. So the contributions, the empirical examples, we are coming from a number of countries, from a number of sectors. Let's move to the next slide. And so the agenda today is varied. So we have a mix of presentations with more interactive sessions. So we are going to start with a presentation based on our research, based on the empirical examples we've been going through. So about principles for accelerating companies' digitalization. Afterwards, we'll switch the mode into a panel discussion. It will be moderated by my colleague Barbora. So in panel discussion, we are going to see and to hear views from a business, from digital innovation hub, from academia. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. I think we'll have some really interesting insights there. Afterwards, actually, we'll get into a coffee break. After the coffee break, we'll hear a presentation from the European Commission by Heidi about the contribution of European Commission in promoting the best practices. Then we go into an interactive session mode again, and we'll be actually asking questions and gathering feedback from the participants of this workshop here. So very much looking forward to that. And afterwards, we're going to have a presentation by Professor Julian Müller from University of Erlangen-Nürnberg. And actually, we'll be hearing a lot during this workshop about good practices and best practices. And sometimes you might think, are there synonyms, or is there a difference? And if there is a difference, does it mean also, but what is the meaning of such a difference in practice? So we'll hear a bit on this during the last presentation of this workshop. You've seen the house rules of the workshop at one of the first slides of this presentation. So just to recall that indeed, so there will be options, possibilities for asking questions. You can do it in chat. You can raise your hand, and then we'll ask you to voice your questions. As well, at several points during this workshop, we'll be asking you also to check, to use your phone to log into the Mentimeter and provide some feedback on what's going on. So we very much hope that the workshop will be interesting, and it will be also very well, given that the information, given the workshop dynamics, we hope it will take around 3 hours, a bit more, but we think that these 3 hours will pass really quickly. So the very last point on the next slide. So we are already moving into our next presentation, but before we do that, we actually asked people who registered for this workshop to also mention, in your view, what are the success factors for industrial company digitalization. So here you see the feedback we received. So it's about funding, about planning, about skills, about training, cooperation, all the important things. So that was the feedback. But now we want to check, we want to look into whether our research is actually in line with this feedback received. So now I pass the screen to my colleague Rūta to present some of the empirical findings based on our research. So Rūta, the floor and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. And as so kindly introduced by my colleagues, I will be presenting the conclusions of the third phase of our study, which concerns the identification of best practices for accelerating company digitalization. So jumping straight into what we did and what our methodology was. If we can move on to the, yes, next slide. So first of all, who are these best practices that we developed for? Our target audience concerns all companies, but we've, in the study, put a special focus on SMEs and companies of average and below average digital maturity. This is important because it influences also our approach and the methodology that we have chosen, as well as the definition of what best practice even means. Of course, in a lot of research that we see, best practices are often linked with state-of-the-art technologies and innovative solutions. However, when we look at companies that may have lower digital maturity or are not so far along on their digitalization journey, what we see from case studies is that a lot of the time these companies actually benefit more from starting with simple solutions or maybe doing smaller projects to begin with. And only after they build their digital capabilities, moving on to more advanced solutions, more advanced technologies, as well as bigger transformations. So therefore, in the context of this study, we define best practice to be a behavior that facilitates digitalization regardless of digital maturity, company size, or technology, meaning that these behaviors would be applicable to all companies regardless of where they are in their digitalization journey. In turn, this also influences how we designed our methodology and what we did. Our entire methodology is based around collecting case studies, company stories of how they digitalized. And the companies that we looked at were very diverse in terms of their digital maturity, in types of technologies they adopted, in the extent and size of the projects they implemented. And therefore, we think that what we developed as the end result will be applicable to all companies, but especially will take into consideration the specifics of SMEs and companies who are not so far along in their digitalization journeys as well, which we think is important. So in terms of the steps that we took, we started by collecting company digitalization stories. In total, we collected 66 of them with the help of digitalization hubs as well as industry experts. We then chose from those companies the most relevant ones, the most relevant stories for the case of our study, and developed a total of 39 company digitalization case studies. The third step then was to use these case studies as a basis to define what were the behaviors and the lessons learned that these companies had as they digitalized that made them successful, that helped them successfully implement digital technologies. As a result, we defined 8 principles that we consider best practices of how companies can behave or act to successfully adopt digital technologies. Finally, the final step is actually today, this workshop. We are validating and elaborating these principles based on your feedback. So we really hope that for your active participation in the interactive parts of this workshop, for your questions, comments, feel free to drop them in the chat as well throughout the presentations. And we really hope to gather some feedback that will help us make sure that these principles reflect everything that is important and that we haven't missed anything during this process. So moving on to the next slide. Before I move on to the principles themselves, I wanted to also make a note on SMEs and digitalization. We hear a lot in other research as well as previous phases in this study about the constraints and obstacles that SMEs face when attempting to adopt digital technologies. You know, they face skill shortages and financial constraints very often, and we talk about how SME digitalization is lower than that of large companies. However, when we specifically focused our study on companies that successfully adopted digital technologies, we noticed that SMEs also have several strengths when it comes to adopting digital technologies that they can take advantage of. So, for example, SMEs being flexible organizations actually is very important in their ability to successfully adopt digital technologies, because research shows us that the flexibility and agility of a company's operations and management practices is very important for it to be successful and adapt to changing market dynamics and consumer preferences, and to kind of readjust their plans as they move on in their digitalization journey. Similarly, the fact that SMEs tend to be more management-centric and have less levels of hierarchy in their organizational structure can lend itself very well to, fostering buy-in and making sure that if the management is supportive of digitalization, that this idea feeds down into the rest of the organization more easily than that could alternatively possibly be done for a larger company. So we thought it was important to highlight this, that SMEs not only face unique constraints or obstacles, but that they also have certain strengths they can take advantage of when it comes to digitalizing. So moving on to the principles themselves. Here you can see a summary of all the principles. I will go one by one in talking about them, and you will see in the upcoming slides that they will contain some of the main conclusions we have from our research and from case study analysis, as well as examples from the case studies of companies who have exhibited these behaviors. So, here this is just a summary, but I will explain in more depth as we move on. Also, I'd like to note that given the time constraint, I may not be able to explain every detail that you will see on the slides. However, all of these presentations we have today will be made available after the event, so you'll have a chance to take a look at them after as well. So moving on to principle 1, which concerns management buy-in as well as agility that I already mentioned. So here we see that, especially in SMEs, but of course in all organizations, management buy-in and strategic alignment with digitalization is very important. It's one of the key determinants of successfully adopting digital technologies. But because of the importance of management, they can act either as a gateway or a gatekeeper for adopting digital technologies based on whether they are supportive and ready for the adoption and have the right mindset for adoption. So when the management is supportive of digital technologies, we see that this is usually cited by case study companies as a big success factor, and that such management are able to foster a culture that in the whole organization moves the company towards digital technology adoption and willingness to experiment and change the ways of working. However, when there might be a lack of management buy-in, we say the companies need to, try several ways to try to convince management that digitalization is actually something beneficial. And we saw different types of ways that companies approach this. So, for example, as you see on the screen in the Hungarian automotive company, where the management was reluctant to invest in technologies where they didn't see a clear payoff within 2 years, talking to other companies and seeing the best practices and the benefits that those companies have observed was actually, very beneficial to convince management that the chosen solution was worth implementing. Similarly, we see that, being aware of technology developments in other companies and networking with other companies can be a powerful tool to convince management that these benefits could actually accrue. And on the point of agility, here, once again, companies that are more ready to change the ways they work, that create a culture of experimentation and a sense of urgency for introducing changes, are also more likely to succeed. And we see this to be the case both in terms of smaller digitalization projects and smaller companies, where we have micro enterprises saying that the management being ready to change the way it works was an important driver of digitalization. But we also see it all the way to large companies implementing digital transformation programs. We see that, therefore, this kind of attitude and culture and agility that the management exhibits can trickle down into the rest of the organization and be very important in, supporting the digitalization efforts overall. Moving on to the second principle, which is very closely linked, as you will see. So fostering employee and third-party buy-in for digitalization. As I already mentioned, when the management is supportive, this tends to, influence the rest of the organization. But this principle more concerns how that can be done. So we see that, of course, the way the change management is done will depend very highly on the complexity and size of the digital transformation that a company is undertaking. Smaller initiatives and smaller companies probably will not have a huge change management formal program in place coupled with them. However, certain elements and principles are there in all cases, or are necessary in all cases. There should be a clear idea on how the digital technology adoption will bring benefits to the company as a whole, but also to the employees working with these new technologies. Then those benefits need to be communicated with the stakeholders that are involved. Both the employees who will have to use the digital technologies, but also what's important to note that in some cases, these may also be customers or other companies in the value chain if they have to engage with these technologies as well. We saw case studies where we had companies walking through their customers and showing them how to use the new technology they were adopting, because they needed to do that to make sure that customers accept it as the new way of engaging with the business. And then an important point here, of course, is also not just to have one-sided communication, but also of management informing what those changes are, but to also receive feedback and have the two-sided dialogue with employees and third parties on how the changes will be beneficial. And the final big point here is, of course, also monitoring and demonstrating progress is a key thing. Whether it's successful pilots, whether it's achieving some KPIs that were set for the digitalization effort, demonstrating that it's actually bringing the efficiencies or the benefits that were envisioned can be a very powerful tool in convincing people to support the further steps in the digitalization journey. So yeah, moving on to the third principle, and this is perhaps one of the more complex ones and the ones that we will engage with the most during this workshop. So setting strategic objectives for digitalization. Here we kind of have divided it in three main points. Firstly, technology and trend monitoring. We see from evidence that companies that stay aware of the different types of technologies and trends and possible opportunities for digitalization that are available are more likely to then also adopt the digital technologies. And here we see different approaches to that. Some companies will build this capability for monitoring trends and the knowledge necessary for that internally. But some companies will also kind of try to engage or rely on external experts or gain this knowledge from external experts, such as digital innovation hubs or support programs or existing tools that gather this information for them. So things like best practice collections, for example, can be helpful. The second point here is identifying digitalization gaps and needs. So of course, similar to the first point, awareness of what digitalization gaps there are in your company and how those could be filled by adopting new technologies. Again, based on the case studies, based on the research, is an important step in choosing the directions where a company should be investing to achieve their strategic objectives in the end. Once again, we see that companies may be able to do this internally if they have the capabilities and the capacities, as well as maybe the tools available to do so. However, very often, what is also beneficial is seeking some type of external expertise, whether it's through public support, whether it's through external contractors, and using existing frameworks, maturity models, readiness assessments to make this assessment as objective as possible, and to also make sure that it's done from a methodological point of view in a way that is useful for the company. Of course, here, when we look at what the European Commission has been doing, the European Innovation Hub initiative and the digital maturity assessment that is part of it are also important tools that can be used for this purpose. Then kind of finally, the third point here, digital strategy. Here we actually find kind of two interesting views that are in tension. From one side, we see that evidence suggests that digital strategy and setting long-term strategic objectives and having long-term planning is important for successfully digitalizing. On the other hand, what we see from practice when we look at case studies is that often SMEs use their, agility and flexibility to be quite reactive in their digitalization and to adapt to changing external conditions rapidly, as opposed to kind of relying on this more long-term planning. Both are important and both have certain benefits. As I already mentioned, agility is very important when digitalizing. On the other hand, this long-term planning perspective is also something that is quite valuable. So we hope to kind of explore this tension a bit more during this workshop, including in our panel discussion. But I think the sort of simple conclusion is that, of course, companies should plan in the long term and should have some strategic objectives, whether it's in the form of, mutual agreement between parties or a formal document, whatever works for a certain company and its digital transformation. But at the same time, it is also important to be willing to frequently review these objectives and to kind of recalibrate them if something changes in the external conditions or the internal conditions of the company. So moving on to principle 4. Of course, this one is not surprising for most people who have been engaging with industry digitalization questions before. Securing the skills needed. We have seen this in previous stages of our study appearing as one of the main problems many companies face when attempting to digitalize. When we talk about skills, and especially digital and hybrid skills of all levels, this is a challenge many companies face. And when we look at the case studies, we see that companies try to solve this in various different ways. Some companies build the capabilities they need to digitalize internally. Some companies, are doing something to upskill or reskill their staff, whether through formal training or by learning through doing. And in some cases, the companies are also relying on external support, whether in the form of public support programs or in the form of, external contractors. In these cases, we think that it's very important to then make sure that there is some kind of transfer of this knowledge and these skills from the external sources to the companies internally. And this is what we see the successful case studies also do. So if we look at the examples included here, so the example from UK, we have a company that collaborated with academic researchers for knowledge exchange and expertise to build their own capabilities as well. We also have company from Hungary in the automotive sector. Here is one of the examples that kind of learn by doing in terms of digitalization without implementing, big training programs or hiring new people necessarily. But as they were implementing these technologies, they made sure to build those capabilities that they can use in future digitalization projects as well. And this is quite a common theme in a lot of cases. SMEs often don't have long-term planning also when it comes to digital skills needs. Instead, if they are investing in trainings, that is to respond to a direct business need or a direct business reality. The same is true for, seeking external expertise. And this kind of learning by doing process, while it is very valuable, once again, this is a question for discussion. Is the long-term planning, something that should be implemented more, and what are the ways in which to do so? So moving on to the next principle. Principle 5 concerns assessing the costs and benefits of digitalization and also ensuring feasibility. What we see from case studies is that, companies are often quite good at assessing the direct costs and the short-term costs and benefits of digitalization. But there's lots of sort of more indirect costs and benefits. For example, in terms of benefits, consumer experience might improve significantly, or their expectations might be met or not met by adopting digital technologies. And this is quite hard to quantify, as well as longer term effects, which again might be also harder to quantify, are sometimes not taken into consideration. Now, we have some examples of companies that actually, like, with outside support, performed a feasibility study. You see here on the example from the textile industry in Romania. But we also have companies where, insufficient calculation of the costs of digitalization and the benefits of digitalization resulted in them failing to adopt a digital technology because they didn't consider all of the costs that would come with implementing it. So once again, we see the same tension as when we talked about digital strategy. Long-term planning and kind of extensive calculations would be beneficial. But then on the other hand, we recognize that, SMEs have limited time, have limited internal resources, perhaps, to do these kind of things. And so once again, the kind of conclusion here is that this is another area where external support can be very valuable for companies to make sure that their digitalization is successful. So, and this is actually something, we explore also in the second point here. Sorry, previous slide. Thank you. With 5.2, we explore the idea of ensuring the necessary capacity to implement digitalization projects. So because we recognize that these resource constraints are a very relevant concern for SMEs, we see that companies that can leverage existing European and national support programs are often benefiting and are often ones that implement digital technology successfully. Now we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So yes, sixth principle is implementation planning. So here, again, very similar logic as what we already discussed with digital strategy. There is a bit of a tension between, the need for long-term planning and the need for agility. And once again, we see that planning, often appears in research as something that is very important, that having milestones, monitoring KPIs, having, the division of responsibilities clarified, these are all important aspects. But because a lot of the time, digitalization is a reactive process to some kind of external or internal changes in the business environment, these things often, are not extensively planned. What is important is to consider, of course, that the level of planning and the level of detail that is put into this planning process in general will highly depend on the scope of the digitalization effort. So when we look at smaller digitalization initiatives, perhaps having an extensive plan to, just subscribe to an e-commerce platform may be unnecessary. On the other hand, if you're doing a whole of the organization large digital transformation, this will require relatively more detailed planning. And of course, when we look at the case studies, we see both kinds of examples. We see companies that, just quickly responding to a need, implement a digital solution within the scope of a few days or weeks even. On the other hand, we have companies, completely changing their business models to adopt new technologies, which is a completely, different process requiring a level of planning that is much more detailed than the smaller project. What is true in both cases, once again, though, is the need for agility and the need for, iteration. So the companies that are able to change their digitalization plans and to kind of adapt as they go based on the results of what they have learned while implementing smaller tests or experiments or certain steps within their digitalization journey are the ones that are more likely to be successful. So the flexible adaptation of plans and this kind of approach is what, often it leads to better results when digitalizing. And once again, we see this in several examples. The companies that, use this iterative approach, that test before implementing things company-wide, that have a culture of experimentation, are the ones that are kind of always citing these as success factors in the case studies as well. So moving on to principle 7. This is perhaps the most horizontal of all the principles we identified, and probably not a surprise for anyone as well. So taking advantage of the wider ecosystem and collaboration, of course, is something that I already highlighted in some of the other principles as well. Because, you know, SMEs are small companies, it is understandable that they will not have all of the possible expertise internally. So engaging with the outside ecosystem is very important in helping them along their digitalization journeys. And we interpret this ecosystem quite widely. We talk about public sector organizations, we talk about universities and academia, we talk, of course, about the European digital innovation hubs and innovation hubs. But we also talk about, you know, other companies in the value chain and the more private sector players who can, you know, share expertise and help each other in terms of adopting digital technologies, because certain benefits can accrue from, you know, doing certain things in the same way along the value chain. So, for example, we have case studies of companies which adopted certain technologies when other companies in the value chain told them, oh, we're going to be able to collaborate better if we all use the same thing. So here we also have quite a few examples. You have two here highlighted on the screen. So one is an Estonian manufacturer of work clothing for the Scandinavian market, which cooperated with several organizations to implement or create a new prototype of their product, such as the Estonian ICT cluster, smart electronics cluster, and a university. We also see that a lot of the companies that we look at, as is the example with the German retailer of lamps here, we're engaging with like public support programs and technical support programs that are available within their country as well, to help them in the digitalization journey. So once again, of course, this collaboration is a very wide-ranging principle, and I think we will definitely explore it in the panel discussion as well as in the interactive parts of the presentation of the workshop later on. But again, very important principle nonetheless. So finally, moving on to principle 8. I know it's a lot of principles we're covering today. So the final principle we developed and found by analyzing the case studies, it concerns choosing a solution and choosing and interacting with technology providers. So what we see from case studies is that a lot of companies consider choosing the right solution and solution provider as a very challenging process. They're often overwhelmed by the many options on the market, or vice versa, may actually not see options that are relevant for their specific needs on the market as well. For example, they might see that there's lots of very advanced solutions that are relevant for maybe bigger companies, but find it difficult to find something that would fit their needs and their price point and their resource constraints. So what we find is that, especially for SMEs, maybe for some companies that are resource constrained, there are often options that are less than state-of-the-art that are relevant as well. And here we look into also low-cost or so-called shoestring technologies that can be viable as well. These include things like open source technologies, off-the-shelf solutions, retrofitting of older machinery instead of buying new machinery. Here, a good example is the example in the middle of this slide, a logistics service provider that adopted AR goggles to guide workers, but instead of using the industrial solution, which was expensive and relatively more complex to use, actually chose to use goggles that were developed for commercial use for regular consumers like all of us, because those were easier for them to implement as well as cheaper. So in a lot of cases, looking at a wider range of solutions that are not necessarily the state-of-the-art, the most innovative, the most expensive, the most complex, can be very relevant for a lot of companies. And of course, once again, because SMEs especially, but all companies cannot have every type of capability internally, interacting with solution providers is usually the way to go for a lot of companies for adopting digital technologies. And here we see that the interaction models between the solution providers and companies are very different in terms of their extent. Like, where companies sometimes adopt, let's say, an off-the-shelf solution, they often will face a relatively hands-off approach. On the other hand, we see that there are companies that go all the way to, creating very close partnerships with solution providers and finding kind of win-win situations for each of them. An example here is the example you see on the right. So from Portugal, we have the company that specializes in knitting sustainable fabrics. And to create a quality control system for their garments, their textiles, they cooperated with a startup that didn't have a ready working solution yet, but that wanted to test their solution that they were currently developing in an industrial setting. As a result, the startup that provided the solution could test it, and this company, this textile company, was the first to be able to implement it once it proved successful and once they developed it to a working model. So, of course, these kind of partnerships are, again, an example of interacting with your ecosystem in a mutually beneficial way. So this is all for the examples. I know it's a lot of information, and of course, once again, this presentation will be available after. But I would like to hand off to the colleagues and maybe some questions as well.
Okay, so thank you very much, Rūta, for this thorough and nuanced presentation. And actually, we do have a number of questions. And so, yeah, we'll try to perhaps address a few of them here. There's some of our questions connect very nicely to the panel discussion we are going to have shortly. So maybe we'll also have those in mind for the panel discussion. So actually, the first question, I'm not sure whether it's more to you or perhaps European Commission could also reflect on this a little bit. So there is a question about the connection. So is there a connection between EU Commission-driven collecting and sharing of best practices and initiatives at the national level? So, yeah, I'm not sure whether, Rūta, you would have a comment on this. What would you say?
Yeah, perhaps this is a question where I can hand it off to the European Commission. I think from our side, these best practices, of course, will be made available, but they are, European level, so they're not focusing on any specific country.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Heidi, are you there? Would you comment on this question?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of questions here, and I guess I will talk a little bit in that kind of direction in my presentation a little bit later. But yeah, I mean, of course, best practice collecting or collecting of examples of good practice or whatever, that is done in various ways, and it's not really a top-down, highly organized matter. I think it can be more of a kind of bottom-up. And I think we see this with this study. I mean, this best practice collection is just part of the work that is going on in this study, and it will be very valuable, obviously, to the outcome and to the toolbox development, and then will be very useful. But the way that this kind of work connects to the member states, of course, is, I mean, it starts from one end and you go into member states and you ask about best practices, you find things on the ground. But then also, when you get to the dissemination stage, this will also be shared both at European level and with member states. For example, I mean, I will say something about kind of preempting myself, but when we disseminate this kind of work, we also, when we meet with member states in more formal settings, in working groups and in commission meetings and things like this is the kind of thing that also gets discussed at that level. So in that way, I would say there's linkages.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for this answer. Then there is both, I would say, a question and maybe a statement. So it's about the relationship between digitalization effort and overall effort that companies have to go through to manage change. And so the question is there anything specific when it comes to the digitalization projects? So what would you say, Rūta?
Indeed, I think that it's very logical that there is an overlap between these principles and general transformation principles, because, of course, digitalization, as any transformation, requires certain like management and planning practices to be in place that are, of course, more broadly applicable. When we look at the specifics of digitalization, I would firstly point to Principle 8, where we talk specifically about selecting a technology, and we talk about interacting with solution providers, because these are, this principle is much more technology oriented. But then, of course, as we go through all of the principles, the tools and the references that we make to existing resources, things like cooperation programs, support programs, all of these will be specific to digitalization, right? So, for example, when we talk about digital maturity assessments, of course, we're talking about tools that are made for the digital transformation effort as opposed to overall transformation. So while the principal names themselves and the overall concepts maybe, sound very general transformation oriented, when you dig into the deeper into the examples that we use, as well as the, different tools that we reference, these will always link more to digitalization specifically as well.
Great, thanks a lot. There is another question, actually, I guess, which is very much of interest also from the perspective of digital innovation hubs present in this workshop. So indeed, you presented very thoroughly the Principle 7 about collaboration. And the question is, so about the level of knowledge of potential agents of change or agents of information that SMEs might have. So do you have an intuition about the level of knowledge among the SMEs with regard to digital innovation hubs?
Certainly, I think we covered this in the previous stages of the project as well. This was highlighted as one of the challenges. And this is definitely something to discuss. What is the best way for hubs to approach SMEs and to make sure that they're informed about the opportunities that there are for digitalization? Because in the previous stages of the project, we saw that lack of knowledge of digitalization opportunities was highlighted by companies as a significant obstacle to digitalization. Of course, in this stage, we focus more on the companies that were successful. So we see a lot of success stories of companies that found a way towards, engaging with these support opportunities, and less of the kind of negative story where they lacked the knowledge. But I would agree that this is definitely a challenge, and that digital innovation hubs especially can, have a very important role in trying to solve that by directing the companies towards different resources.
Absolutely. And maybe let's check out one more question, and then we can move on, because some of the questions are indeed very directly related to what we are going to discuss during the panel discussion. So there is a question which is actually pretty much related to what we already mentioned about this relationship between digitalization projects and broader change management and lean. And actually the question here is, or perhaps suggests, that there might be some kind of timing question here. So perhaps at the organizational level, you first go through some introduction of lean and change management, or maybe you deal with your processes, and then you go into the digitalization. So what would you think, Rūta? Is there indeed this kind of aspect in terms of time, or things usually happen in parallel?
So I would say that, it depends from company to company and from case study to case study. We definitely have companies, though, that are combining both things, that will be mapping the entirety of their processes to identify inefficiencies and then using digitalization as a way to solve those. And actually, these kind of principles, such as using lean methodologies, can be very powerful in demonstrating the potential benefits that digitalization could have. But in terms of whether a company previously simplifies or optimizes their processes before digitalization, or after or during, this will change depending on the company itself. What we see, of course, is that there are companies that are using digital technologies to optimize their processes, and that are using these methodologies to justify that choice. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. Well, I hope so too. But indeed, I mean, I guess we need to move on into the next stages of the workshop, and I think we'll have a chance to both raise and address those questions in our formats during this workshop, because indeed, I mean, what we are doing here is also we are moving a little bit into this into discussion, which will indeed have this WUSA term in mind, right? So the WUSA term is mentioned in comments. So so that's about this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous word. So the panel discussion is also indeed an important element of a panel discussion is the strategy and planning versus realities and short-term realities of the world we are living in. So so yeah, let's see what happens during the panel discussion. And now I'm handing over to my colleague Barbora to host this panel discussion. So Barbora, over to you.
Thank you very much, Egidijus. So I'm very pleased. I was listening very intensely to the conversations that were taking place. I was also taking note of the comments. Indeed, this VUCA, I think, will be a keyword, and it has been a keyword in our discussions and research so far. Egidijus, thank you for defining it and for breaking down what it means. So I'm very thrilled to run a panel together with 3 speakers today. Irina and Katrin, perhaps you can also turn on your cameras so we can see you and also hear you. Great. So it's a pleasure to have 3 speakers with us today on the panel. We'll try to, I think, go a bit deeper and further into the topics that Rūta presented and I think really resonated in the chat. During the panel, similarly as during the Rūta's presentations, please ask questions in the chat or also raise your hand after we're finished. So today in the panel discussion, I'm joined by 3 speakers, each representing, I would say, a different side of the ecosystem. We have a business representative, we have a digital innovation hub representative, and we also have a digitalization experts more broadly who kind of will look at this from what the broader evidence is suggesting. So allow me to introduce the 3 speakers. So we have Irina Toma, who is the coordinator of Futures Innovation Technology FIT, European Digital Innovation Hub, and she has over 10 years of experience working with digitalization, innovation, and sustainability. Throughout her career, Irina has worked with digitalization of very various sectors, most of them very related to our study, so including agri-food, manufacturing, textiles, construction, digital health, among others. We also have Katrin Schade, who is a research associate at the Institute for Urban Development and Construction at the University of Leipzig. And her research focuses on smart cities, digitalization of retail and urban development more broadly. Finally, or last but not least, as is very much often said, we have Cătălin Podaru, who is the founder and acting CEO of Leviatan Design, one of the leading engineering companies in Romania. And Cătălin witnessed and led Leviatan through an extensive period of digitalization. I think that lasted more than 10 years and involved several stages. So I'm very keen to ask some questions to all of you today. I think I can introduce all of you for much longer, but actually let's go to the questions. So maybe to start us off and kind of deep dive sort of way to also what were the last questions asked in the chat as well. So as Rūta mentioned, we see that there is somewhat of a tension between the fact that SMEs, their strength is their flexibility and adaptability. SMEs are very quick to react to the outside world and kind of the different risks that we see come up now more often and often. Yet research really suggests the importance of having planning, having digital strategies, having roadmaps in place, and really thinking long-term when it comes to digitalization. Yet a minority of the companies that we looked at actually had these in place. So I will ask maybe a broad question on how can SMEs implement long-term strategic planning while actually maintaining agility and reacting to these day-to-day challenges that occur. So maybe I'll start actually with Cătălin, because you represent a company here and I think you have a personal story as well that I think would be very interesting to hear in the context of this question.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. So regarding this question, I believe that indeed there is the need of a planning. In our case, such a plan was not materialized in a written strategy, but actually we have, let's say, a general overview of objectives where we want to reach in time. Now we have it materialized more like a mind map of objectives. But the transformation for us was indeed quite agile, identifying the needs, the problems, and finding the solution. Also, as mentioned before, in our case, what was the first step in this was actually a real transformation of processes, mapping the processes initially, have it well structured, and then finding the right tools and softwares to implement those processes more agile, more lightly for the user. And then we actually we kind of took it on a step-by-step process, and this helped us a lot also with the change management in the company, because the changes came one by one, and people actually were easy to accept these changes. So moreover, what's important in our case for these changes is that we had a group, an initial group in industry. They are called champions, early adapters with a change mindset that were part of these processes, process mapping, process changes, experimenting. Every time we have in our company experimental phase where we test the solution to see they are viable, they are easy to adopt, and then actually we materialize. So I don't know if this answered your question, but this was the process in our case, and it's a continuous process also.
I think that's a key word, right? It's a continuous process. Maybe I can ask a quick follow-up as well, Cătălin. What was your motivation in the first place at Leviatan to start digitalizing? What kind of kick-started this whole journey of digitalization?
What our intention is to actually create a system in the company that was not based only on certain people, because in every company, in every startup, you have the founder that kind of is involved in everything. So then you add up people with skills and knowledge that are growing. But in any company, personal fluctuation are happening. Even the founder from a level on cannot be anywhere. And we actually wanted to create a system where things are done on a standard way, easy to adopt by any new employee, that after acquiring very fast the knowledge of how to perform the task, then he could improve upon that. Moreover, to add up to this system, our intention was to also create organizational memory, as we said, because we want to keep inside our processes, written processes, and then strategies, all the skills and the lesson learned step by step on each other. We actually have ongoing process on learning the lesson and then disseminating them easily to all our employees, because the system and the quality of the product or the service we deliver, we want to be predictable. So having this system that would be at the core of the company and presenting predictability both for employees but also for the clients was the main the startup point where we want to where we want to go from initially.
Very clear. I kind of wrote in bold organizational memory and predictability. I think that's really important. Katrin, I think I will turn over to you because from what I remember, your research focused a lot on the smaller, like really micro enterprises. And I'm curious, what is their experience when it comes to digitalization? Is it usually a reaction to something that's, you know, outside the world and outside crisis? Or is it more of this carefully long-term planning process that you observed?
Thank you, Barbara. I think it really depended on the single interviewer I was talking to. Like, some were from their previous experience that they had from working in another company or working in a certain field. They already brought a lot of know-how and skills into their company. I mainly deal with retail companies. That they helped them further also with digitalization. So for example, I had a controller who was already involved in digitalization processes before, so that helped them a lot to develop the company further. And some interviews also said that it also depends a lot on how well you know your business. So if you know your business well, your customers, you know the market, then it's easier to develop digital skills as well, or implement digital tools. So that was also very important. And some said that they have the feeling that some companies don't know these processes very well. So it's actually more a problem that needs to be solved before thinking of digital tools and then thinking of how to implement those ones. So these were like two processes, and I think one needs to be highlighted also, that also Cătălin said, that it really depends on the people that are employed. So if you have small companies and you have maybe 2, 3, or maybe 4 people employed, then it really depends on their personal skills and also the conditions and everything, how they adapt to these tools. So if you're one person in charge, like one manager, and you have to deal with the lack of skills and different lacks of skills of your personnel, then it's really difficult to develop these tools further and to implement it.
Very relevant indeed. Adaptability, skills, and actually knowing your market and knowing where you fit in the bigger ecosystem. Irina, I will turn to you with a slight variation of this question. As a digital innovation hub, I think you work with many different companies and you do see many different scenarios of how digitalization plays out. So maybe what's your take on this long-term planning versus really being agile and reacting to the market, and what has been your experience as a hub from working with companies and, you know, using innovation roadmaps, digitalization strategies? How do companies interact with these materials?
Hey, Barbora, and thank you for inviting me to share our experience from the central region of Romania here. Central region, first of all, and I think most parts of Romania are very, very lowly digitalized. There are a lot of companies struggling even with basic technologies here. And my experience of working with SMEs has been that they definitely need support in getting orientation, in understanding what technologies are relevant for their company and then prioritizing them, in developing a financing plan for the different types of technologies that they need, because a company that barely has a website but is doing well in manufacturing or in another sector, they might find it challenging to implement even a basic ERP at the beginning, and then even think about the investments needed in order to digitalize or their equipment, their manufacturing equipment. And all this requires specialized knowledge that they usually don't have access to. We've been very happy to run a few pilots also through the Digitalized SME pilot project that preceded the Digital Innovation Hub program. And that allowed us to bring specialized expertise to certain factories. And that was really helpful. But also our experience has shown that even though you create this roadmap, it often takes many years for companies to be able to follow up with it. And that's why I'd like to congratulate Cătălin for having implemented such a profound digital transformation in his company in only 10 years. And I think that required a lot of commitment and a lot of perseverance. And I'm glad he had the vision and the strength to carry it through. And I find it very valuable that we're looking at different models and various experiences of companies through this study, because we definitely have to figure out how to become closer to companies and offer the services that they really need in order to become more digitally mature. And I think this is our mission as digital innovation hubs, and we're very excited to work with companies in the coming 3 years on these issues.
Thank you, Irina. And a question, a follow-up on the digital maturity assessments. This is something I think that the Commission promotes and is also done by digital innovation hubs. I think that also usually something that's helpful for companies in identifying their needs a bit more, maybe seeing their gaps, right, and really thinking of what technologies can be helpful for them. Has that been the experience at the hub as well?
Yeah, so we've been discussing, obviously, because we're preparing the launch and all the services, and we've been discussing how to conduct these studies with the SMEs. I think for them, it will be a real benefit to just have an assessment and really for somebody, and I'm speaking here not necessarily for the front runners, but for the great mass of companies that are just starting on the digitalization journey. And I just think a basic assessment of where they are on different aspects of their company will be very helpful. And I think they'll be very curious to know how they compare with other companies in their region. As far as I know, the digital maturity assessment tool doesn't yet provide this benchmarking option, but it would be something very interesting. And also to create a cross-European comparison, because of course, for example, Romanian companies are interested in learning how their Spanish or their Portuguese counterparts are doing. And I think we have a lot of opportunities to develop this further in the coming period. Yeah.
Great. Cătălin, I saw you also nodding just now when we spoke about, understanding where your company stands and understanding your needs. So is this something that Leviatan did, or maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about how you went about, identifying your needs for digitalization and maybe mapping these processes that you mentioned? What was the experience there?
So actually, I was nodding because even for us, going through the process, sometimes you are fully immersed in your transformation, but in order to, let's say, to have a reference point or about what you're doing, this is something that you need to know. Also in Romania, and not only in Romania, we see a lot of people in the past 3 years at least, but even earlier in our industry, speaking about the need to approach technical changes, technological changes, and also digitalization. So when you're doing that, I think from time to time having this like a test benchmark to see where are you actually, if it's the right way. It's kind of like a navigation compass that the route you took on it's good, and also in time you can learn from best practices and time to implement. Also you need to know if your process is fast or it's slow. So this information, I think it's important for us. We in terms of how we did it, I told you that what we did initially was need driven, so our needs were the driver to go on. But from time to time we stop and evaluate from open sources, from best practices presented in different materials, and especially in construction, because we have a standard BIM process that actually refers to the whole industry on implementation digitalization. This is a standard at the level at the European Union. So we stop and see if our mapping implementation of the certain processes and software instruments is accordingly to the BIM principles, which helped us seeing that we are going to the right path. Moreover, because in construction, even Romania now has voted the memorandum of a roadmap, national roadmap to transform the construction industry and make it accordingly to the BIM process, which is a European Union directive on transforming construction process and acquisitions. Actually, even for us, seeing these changes that were happening and seeing that the industry will go from a certain point on a standard, national or European standard, it was important for us to know that at that point, the way we develop our processes and digitalize our process are still compatible. So this is another aspect that was important for us to see that going forward, we are going the right direction. When the standard will be general, applied by national laws or regulation, we will be compliant or compatible. So that was important for us. Luckily, with all the digital hubs, because also we have in Romania clusters and hubs that are focused on this kind of transformation, we were glad to see that we actually are living inside the principle that governs this process transformation, BIM process transformation. And we saw that if with any international standard that exists in other country, we can easily match up to it and be compatible.
Thank you, Cătălin. So indeed, knowing your needs, but also knowing the market, again, really what Katrin was saying, seeing how the market is developing and how your company is fitting into that market to make sure everything is kind of compatible and you're moving in the right direction. I would like to also turn to Katrin again, because you mentioned this, and I think some other panelists also mentioned the importance of the right attitude on company culture. And Katrin, you just mentioned as well that even when you have 3 or 4 people, there can already be some challenges for tensions. I don't know, in your experience and from your research, how can companies facilitate or foster this culture that's open to change and open to maybe this uncertainty that sometimes digitalization can bring?
Well, I think communication was the key in these processes, like that the manager was able to communicate well with the staff and also to have the opportunity to send them to some training. And I think this was also one of the main problems, that knowing the right providers for the tools and then having the opportunity to get some training, some proper training that kind of applies to all the lacks of skills that the staff had. That was a certain problem. So finding a service provider and also finding a way to train them in a certain way, and also finding the time, because for small companies it's always a time issue, and to make sure that all the needs are adapted somehow. So yeah, to kind of find a way to train them while doing these processes and developing the tools further, this was one of the main issues. And I think, like, when we turn to service providers, this is probably something that we also should talk about. Like, how can these companies find the right providers for what they want to pursue in the company? And I thought for most of the interviews I had, this was one of the main issues. Because there's so many out on the market, and to figure out who's the right one and who has the most interfaces for all the tools that they need, that was a huge problem. And what helped further in this way was to go on fairs. Actually, what a few interviews told, that they are going on fairs and find or connect with providers, talk to them, communicate to them, and then also have a look at who is available regional, to, in case there's any problem, to go talk to them, but also have someone available who can come over and solve a problem if there's any.
I will actually maybe open the floor, but Irina, Cătălin, would you like to react? Because I think service providers is indeed a big aspect of, you know, how you continue in the road to digitalization. And I saw both of you were sort of nodding at the same time.
Yeah, because actually when you start doing that and you make a choice about choosing your service provider, even for us was a challenge. What would we choose? Because this choice, it's long-term, not mid-term, it's long-term. Both because every service provider, in our case, software providers, it's important to meet many needs, to be compatible with different solutions. But also, what was important for us to know that there is a service provider that has an ongoing development of solutions, and this is something we took in consideration, although sometimes was a leveling between a certain provider and the cost of the service. But eventually all this analysis took us to choosing the long-term solution, the provider that we knew that it was going to develop continues the solution he offered, because once you make the investment and you start training the people, modifying the process, making internal manuals as we did, and utilizing these softwares, for example, it's kind of hard to go back and say, okay, I choose wrong, so now everything we start from the beginning. So in our case, we went with a long-term solution, taking the service provider with the most comprehensive, let's say, spectrum of solution for every needs, with the compatibility and in a, let's say, reasonable budget according to our budget that we had for this.
Very clear. So once again, I think it goes back to knowing your needs, right? Knowing what you need in the long term, understanding your processes, also your constraints at the same time. And Katrin, I see you have your hand raised, so go ahead.
Thank you, Barbara. I also had two experiences from the Netherlands and also Switzerland, like from the States, who gave out vouchers to get in contact with service providers. So they got some kind of voucher to first get in contact and get some ideas what the service providers offer, and then be able to choose wisely what suits best for the company. And these two examples were like told to be very good to develop further with the service providers. So I think it was like vouchers for a certain amount of money that they could spend for a certain provider and just get some information.
Indeed, I think kind of this collaboration was one of the keywords that we saw in the mind map earlier when we were asked, when we were asking our participants what is important for digitalization. And indeed, we see the sort of matchmaking or a little encouragement for SMEs can be very helpful when looking for solutions. Irina, maybe as an experience from the hub, what role does collaboration play in more broadly when it comes to digitalization?
Well, as I was smiling because the more I start working on the hub, the more I realize that it is really, the ecosystem is really important. And we were touching on the topic of collaboration a little bit, and maybe a little background of how I met Cătălin. So we were asked as part of the study to investigate the construction sector, and this was a new sector for us, but we've delved into it and learned a lot from it. And it was very interesting for us, and it will be part of the experiment that we'll be running also as part of this project, to collaborate with specialists in terms of the actual technologies that are used in a specific sector. So people who work with advanced BIM technologies, for example, and can provide very in-depth technical support maybe to SMEs. And we wouldn't be able to do this ourselves without the support of the ecosystem, without the support of service providers to come and advertise their solutions. And the more we start developing this, I realize how important it is. And I think it will be maybe one of our main functions, in a sense, as digital innovation hubs, to enhance this and make sure we do the right matchmaking. So it's exciting.
Great. I'm a bit conscious of the time, and actually I would like to read one question from the chat, because we also had this question, at least I had it in my notes, so I think it really links nicely to the discussion. Cătălin mentioned the budgetary constraints and kind of really knowing the constraints inside which you operate as a company when digitalizing. And we also have a question in the chat on how to design digitalization actions which have impact also on the short term. Because really digitalization costs sometimes we see explode, either because the needs were not fully assessed, or because maybe it's just more complex than was initially foreseen. And usually the digitalization benefits, you see them a bit later, they're not immediate. Sometimes maybe it's a bit of a mess, and then you come out of the other side and suddenly you have a great story and everything is working well. So how to design digitalization which have an impact also on the short term, I think is maybe a question of the day for the panel. And I will allow whoever wants to react first, go first.
So if you allow me, yes, the budget is important, especially for the SMEs, because the access to funding is not so easy as for bigger corporation. But in our case, I think that digitalization was definitely it's a long-term decision, strategic decision in terms of benefits. In our case, one of the first words I wrote on the mind map was perseverance, because this is very important. So a lot of companies take this. We saw this in our counterparts in the market. They took the decision and say, okay, I'll buy the software, I will start doing that. And after a few months, they say, okay, we have to have work to do. So this is not going anywhere. It's taking too much time. And this is collaborated with the change management, because the attitude of people changing the way are used to do things together with the pressure of delivering, sometimes they got frustrated. So what we did, actually, we set up, let's say, a lab inside our company where we hire people specifically to do this kind of testing and standard creation, procedure creation, without putting them on the process of delivering to the clients, because it's not going to happen. Of course, they interacted with the needs of the people that were working on projects to better understand what we have to do at the end, what we have to deliver. But we actually led these people, as in the lab, to test, develop, write it down, and generate best practice for the colleagues. So actually, you see, in general, the mixture, that there is a hybrid solution. You cannot go say, okay, I will have an unlimited budget. That's not the case. But anyhow, you have to assess a bit of the budget, at least what you can at the beginning, because even in our situation, there are things before starting you take in consideration, but there are a lot of other things that come along that are resource let's say, expenditure. So you cannot all the time take all this in consideration. So to somehow answer the question, it's small steps, but perseverance, and also a mixture of things. People creating a lab of creating best practices, not being involved in the process of delivering meanwhile, because this is hard to handle.
So maybe indeed perseverance and starting small, experimenting if the size allows, right? Because sometimes it's the same, if in the case of very small companies, it's the same people doing a bit of everything at the same time. Irina and Katrin, would you like to add something to this complex question?
I can maybe start, Irina, if that's okay. I might highlight 3 little things. Like some interviews mentioned that knowing your recurring costs is very important. Not only the one-time costs, but the recurring costs that come monthly. Having a good overview is very important. Another thing is that actually not everything costs a lot especially when you think about retail. I don't know about other industries, but for retail, for example, doing good or making good product photos is already possible with a very good cell phone camera. So some said you don't actually need to pay a lot all the time. Sometimes it's already, some things are available on the market that you can invest in one time and then you have it, and it actually helps you further for a long time. And the third thing is, sometimes you can't really see the effect or the monetary effect from the beginning. For example, my research very much focuses on local online platforms where retailers come together and collaborate. And at the moment, I have the feeling that there's not a solution where the companies actually make a lot of money with it, but the marketing effect is very good. So if they collaborate and they're available or they're visible on the market, then a lot of companies told that more people were coming into the store and mentioning the platform. So there's a combination between physical and online, and I think that becomes more important, even though you can't see the monetary effect right away.
I think these 2 are very key points. We'll have a presentation later by Julian, who I think will talk a little bit about these low-cost solutions that maybe you don't immediately think of them as the best practice, but usually for SMEs it can be enough. Like you mentioned, digital phone cameras can really be sufficient in some cases. And also these hidden benefits. Not all benefits can be quantified in the short run, but maybe in the long run they do bring benefits for the company. So I cannot agree more. Irina, would you like to add something as well to this question?
I just want to strengthen some points that were made, and I would be a bit blunt in saying that I don't think digitalization is a short-term thing. I don't think we should expect it to be that way. I think you needed to give it a year or more to see what it's done for you. And so if this is a short term, then yes. But I think what speaks a lot to companies is examples of good practices. And I think we need to collect them and play them over and over with information that is relevant about how much more efficient things have become and what problems has it helped solve. And I think, to me, this is the most convincing argument. And I think it's also a question of business model. And if people just adopt things without considering the full business model of their business, how they're going to use it, what their cost structures are, I think they can run into problems a little bit. And so I think digital innovation hubs, but also other supporters of digitalization and companies themselves should think about this a little bit and think a bit about the market and if their products justify, the clients justify a little bit the type of upgrade they want to build, and if not, to try to go for those markets as well. So there is a little bit of play, I think, in terms of adapting the whole business model of the company to these new digital technologies so that it completely makes sense. And that's what we want to see.
Great. We have 2 more questions in the chat, and I will try to ask both of them. They're quite different, but I think very interesting. So one question is about digitalization and competition. So on one hand, you have digitalization when it comes to adopting Microsoft Office or using an ERP system. So this kind of small steps that look at internal processes really, but it can also be seen as a fundamental shift in the market dynamics. We have, especially with the platform economy, we see a very big shift in how it operates. So the question, I think, is really, does the panel expect that SMEs that digitalize will face increasing competition in their markets? I think that's the question, really. And in case I phrased it wrong, I would also ask the person who wrote this question to unmute and maybe clarify your point. But if the essence of the question is clear, I will also hand over to the panel to react. Digitalization and competition in the market.
Yeah, if you let me, in my opinion, especially in construction, digitalization in terms of competition, and not only, is a disruptive element now, because in construction things are done basically kind of the same way for a lot of years. So applying digitalization and modern tools shifts the paradigm, and they are actually disruptor because it changes the way company functions, they deliver, and this we have seen it in a lot of industries, no? So the possibilities change. The scalability of the business, especially in construction, is quite hard to do it. But when you use digital tools, digital processes, it is disruptive. So, of course, having more and more of companies doing this, for sure, can rise up the competition. But actually, by rising up the quality of the service, maybe lowering the budgets in time, and why not shorten the times of delivery? So nowadays, I think that Irina said that also there is a marketing benefit. That's for sure. That's for sure, because with these tools, you even for new employees, you become more attractive. They want to work in companies that things are done a lot easier. They can focus more of their energy, less on repetitive tasks or boring tasks, but more on value adding activities. And even in the sites in construction, we see a lot of automation or semi-automation processes taking place that are based upon digital processes in the office, in the design part, in the architectural part. So all of this kind of gives a competitive edge to the companies that implement that. First as a marketing, but actually the processes become more lighter and more attractive for the client, more transparent even. So we have a lot of clients say, oh, why would we want to approach the new solution that is different? So we present them the benefits of having a clear view of their project, because we are speaking of the product. They can actually be directly connected to the development. They can see what's happening there. They can assure also as a client a certain governance and a certain quality of what's being delivered. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, in time this can bring a reduction of time and of a better use of resources. And nowadays you see that we were speaking about climate and objectives or sustainability objectives. This is very hard to handle, to manage in the construction process, where there are so many stakeholders during the process, without having digital advanced tools in place that allows you this level of control and implementing this level of governance. So that's why the benefits can rise up very fast if you do this. More even in the exploitation part of the buildings. This is crucial if you want to have sustainable buildings. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Cătălin. I actually will jump to the next question for the sake of time, and it's really about change management. I think Rūta touched upon this in her presentation. We also had some questions before, and it's about how important it is to actually manage changes within the organization as you digitalize. And the question is, are there dedicated use cases for successful change management in this context? This time I will actually maybe point a finger or a pen at Irina. Does anything come to mind from the experience of Innovation Hub when it comes to change management and how to manage it successfully?
Well, this I find challenging because I don't think there is it's not like you run a presentation or there's a methodology to change the culture of an organization. Well, there are some methodologies, but I mean it's not just something you do. It's not a new trick that you do, but more that I think you need to inspire the people and give them constant reassurance that it's possible, that they can overgo the initial period when you're still running on two systems. And this is something that I've learned also speaking to a lot of companies, also in the construction sector. And I think it will be important for digital innovation hubs to support companies through this process, because I'm sure that those years of transition are really not easy and they bring a lot of operational questions. But so I think it's a question of encouragement and maintaining the motivation and sort of creating this sort of team spirit to pull through. And then I think things come easier, but it's more of a softer skill and a softer process or softer type of support that's a bit harder to put your finger on. I think we'll be developing, for example, as part of the skills and upskilling work package in our digital innovation hub, will be helping companies create a plan to think about how the whole organization needs to change and how the positions in a company need to change as a result of the new processes and the new technologies installed. But this softer thing, I think it's a question of team building and a bit more heart-to-heart with the people that you work with. And I'm not sure I can give a recipe for that, but it's definitely something to keep in mind.
I think in general, it's very tempting to give recipes and to have, 5 things you should do to be successful, but the reality is very often a lot more complex. Maybe Katrin, any final remarks before we close this panel?
Thank you. When I think about change management, in especially in retail, but also other industries, I think research or academia could play a certain role, because especially when I think about these local online platforms, mostly it was that academia was involved to show a little bit of another way to develop the businesses further. There was one in the Ruhrgebiet, which is like part of central West Germany, that was developed through funding of the ministry, and also academia involved, and also the city involved. And they all together were collaborating with the retailers and showing what is necessary and how it could be done. And I think to really promote change management, especially when you have companies that develop very different and also at different times, which I think is very important when you think about digitalization. Companies that are on the market for 20 years and started also when digitalization processes just started and nobody thought of interfaces or anything. And then you have these new companies who are just evolving and have all the opportunities and who are totally different from their mindset. And I think these collaborations of academia, but also ministries and cities especially, but also other organizations or institutions are very important to promote this change management.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Again, we see the word collaboration come up again and again. So I think this is really key. And I think it's a little bit what we're doing here today. We're bringing together different people from the different sides of the ecosystem together to talk about the best practices. I also see some ideas in the chat that maybe we should also talk in the future about the worst practices or things to avoid at all costs. I think this is quite an interesting idea to explore, so we can reflect about that a little bit all together. There is some questions in the chat that I think we will explore very shortly together, as we will now have a short break, a 15-minute break, and afterwards we'll hear again from Heidi on what the Commission is doing to promote best practices and collaboration. And then we'll have a working session together with you, as some of these questions, I think they're a bit tricky to answer by 4 people in the panel. So let's use all of.
So hello, everyone, again. Hope that you have had a chance to grab a bit of coffee or maybe tea. But so now we are ready to continue with our workshop. And the next point on our agenda is a presentation by Heidi Cigan from the European Commission. And well, the name of the presentation is, I would say, a rather humble one. It's about how the European Commission is promoting best practices, but actually European Commission has quite some clout, not only in promoting best practices, but actually, I would say, making sure that there are more of those best practices around. So Heidi, over to you to comment on European Commission's contribution. So it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. I just share my screen. So indeed, what I want to talk about more precisely is, digitalization of businesses and the role that best practices can play, and how the Commission is making use of best practices to support what we call the digital decade. So, first we need to say something about the benefits of digitalization, the benefits of digital. So, digitalization is responsible for a significant proportion of growth and competitiveness in the economy, and also to a growing number of jobs. If we think alone about all the ICT professionals that are being employed, and it's projected that by 2030 we might need as many as 20 million ICT professionals in the EU economy, and we're far from achieving that goal at this stage. Digitalization, it makes the economy more resilient to economic shocks, and it's part of what we call the twin transition. So, digitalization and greening of the economy working hand in hand. And it contributes to tackling both climate change and reducing our dependency on Russian oil and gas. Digitalization also, we could see during the COVID pandemic, it helped us to tackle the pandemic itself. It supported the economy and social activity, and it also helped the health situation. So there are many, many benefits to digitization that that motivate us to continue with this path of digitization. But in terms of digitization, we have significant deficits to where we would like to be. The pandemic has highlighted many of these deficits, and we're a long way still from our digitalization goals. So there are low levels of digital skills in the economy. Only around 56% of the population have at least a basic level of digital skills. Infrastructure is also lacking, especially if we're talking about the more advanced things like 5G. And digitalization of public services is also lagging behind. And then last but not least, and that's what we're sort of most interested here today, is in terms of business digitalization. So there is slow take-up of advanced technologies by businesses such as artificial intelligence, big data and cloud, but also, and maybe even more importantly, SMEs lag behind in digital adoption. So, SMEs make up the largest proportion of businesses in Europe, and they contribute massively to our economy. but only around 60% of them have a basic level of digital intensity. And this is really a problem if we want to really successfully digitize our economy and take benefit from all these positive things that digitalization can bring. So in view of all of this, the Commission came forward with its Digital Decade policy. And this is basically a policy towards improving the digitalization of Europe up until 2030. And to sort of guide us in the achievement of digitizing the economy and the society more profoundly, the Commission has identified 4, I would call it, cardinal points or points of emphasis that it wants to target, and also defined targets for each of these. So the first one is skills. Then there's infrastructure, as mentioned, the digitalization of public services, and then last but not least, of course, business digitalization. And in the area of business digitalization, there are 3 key targets. The first one is achieving a high level of take-up of advanced technologies, of cloud, AI, big data. The second one is to grow innovators, to grow scale-ups and finance. To finance and double the EU unicorns that we have. And then, of course, then there's what we call the late adopters. And this refers again to what I was talking to you about digitalizing SMEs more profoundly. So the goal here is to achieve 90% of SMEs with at least a basic level of digital intensity. So these targets are very challenging, very ambitious targets. And to ensure that we can sort of move in the right direction and hopefully reach these targets by 2030, the Commission has come forward with a path to the digital decade. So it's put forward plans and structures so that we can achieve these targets. So the targets were one thing, and also to contribute to achievement of the targets, of course, we need to know what our current status is and what our path towards these targets should be. So the Commission, together with its research arm, the Joint Research Centre, has been working on projecting the trajectories at EU level and national level to see how we can get there, what the path should be to achieving these targets. The Commission has also put together a joint governance framework with the member states to progress in this area and to be able to set these individual targets and to assess as time goes on, and then provide advice if there are insufficiencies and things need to be changed. Then there are also something called the multi-country projects, which are cross-EU projects, sort of EU-wide projects with multiple member states and private sector as well, which also focus in different areas. And the hubs that we've been mentioning, and many of whom are participating today, is one of these multi-country projects. Then the fourth point is that there has been produced a digital citizenship principles, if you like, to protect the rights and principles of European citizens in a digital environment. And then last and definitely not least is, of course, the Commission has been putting forward its funding, directing its funding in a massive way towards digitalization, because digitalization together with greening is one of the top priorities of the Commission. So it has introduced the Digital Europe programme, which focuses very much on this implementing Digital Europe programme, which is about the adoption of digital technologies. And then the Recovery and Resilience Fund as well also has 20% dedicated to digitalization projects. And then Horizon Europe, of course, that's research into digitalization, and then other things also like regional funds. So just to say a little bit more about the Digital Europe programme. So this is the first EU programme that is specifically dedicated to support the rollout of digital technologies across the economy. And what it does is it provides grants up to a value of 7.5 billion for projects in 5 key capacity areas. So high performance computing, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, advanced digital skills, which of course we know is very, very important. And then last but not least, again, it's the European Digital Innovation Hubs project, which, like I said, is the focus of it is to support SMEs on their digitalization journey, to get more SMEs to start that journey and to be successful at it. The project will also support public sector organizations, just to add that. So why the focus on SMEs? Why do we need to have these specific structures in place? Why do we need to hold SMEs' hands, if you want, to jump on the digitalization bandwagon? Well, we know that SMEs, they face particular barriers to digitalization. We've heard today, of course, that that they have also benefits in terms of agility and things like that, but also they do face particular challenges. And I've listed a few of those challenges here. So, lack of knowledge of their own state of digitization, understanding about how digital technologies can benefit them, not having enough skilled staff to implement digital transformation, not knowing which technologies are the right ones for them, and how to access the right suppliers and which ones to choose from. And then, of course, the big one, difficulties in accessing finance. And then there are psychological factors as well, like fear of change and lack of buy-in, and then fear of costs and the risks of failure. So this is something that the digital innovation hubs have been specifically designed, I would say, to try to help. So the European digital innovation hubs, they should really try to reduce the barriers to SME digitalization. They are basically one-stop shops for digital transformation services for SMEs and public sector organizations. And you can see in this diagram the types of activities that the digital innovation hubs support. So they will carry out digital maturity assessments so that companies know their starting points and where they're lacking and what their needs are. They will also provide advice on technologies and how to transform the business to gain the benefits that they could get from digitization. They will provide test before invest services. Very importantly, linking to local suppliers. It was mentioned earlier by Irina, that this will be one of the most important activities that the hubs might be doing. In fact, making this matchmaking between companies and providers. Training, of course, and then helping with access to finance. So the hubs network is now just starting up. We had an initial call and 136 European digital innovation hubs have been selected for the initial network. And these are all across Europe. They're in all regions, they cover all sectors and all technologies. And very importantly, we really want this to be a network so that the hubs can support each other, learn from each other, and that companies in any part of the EU, in any region with any digitalization requirements can get the support they need, so that even if their local hub can't provide what they need through their local hub, they can access skills and knowledge and expertise from other parts of the network. And of course, there's more to come. So the initial network will be 136 hubs, but we're currently also doing a second call, and that is to fill the gaps in the network. So we should gain a few more hubs that will also join the network next year, towards the end of next year. And then above and beyond this, in the last call, in addition to the 136 hubs that we evaluated positively to fund, we also awarded 89 seals of excellence. So these were for hubs that had a sufficiently good quality to participate in the network, but weren't above the threshold for the funding that was available for this project. And these projects, these Seal of Excellence hubs, will be able to go and get funding from other sources to be able to participate in the network. And some member states are specifically planning this. They're going to support these additional hubs from other sources, national sources and other EU funds like European Regional Development Fund. So in the end, we could expect to have a network of 200 or more hubs covering the whole territory. So now turning to the question of best practices and how that fits together with everything that I've just said now. So best practices, I think, can be seen as a catalyst for digital transformation. Best practice identification, analysis, and sharing are drivers of a successful digitalization. They provide successful examples of digital transformation. They show what worked and how it was achieved. They can reduce the psychological barriers to undertaking a digitalization journey, can help fill knowledge gaps, reduce perceived and actual risks, and therefore, incentivize change, and as a final result, improve the chances of success. So just to conclude, I would say, best practices can incentivize and increase the chances of successful digitalization. The best practices and best practice principles identified in this study will support the network of EDIHs, and the Commission is supporting their collection and sharing through studies like this one, through reports, through workshops, and also through works with member states and industry stakeholders in various fora. This work will provide a boost to digitalization, and then hopefully, of course, help us towards the achievement of the digital decade targets. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions.
So thank you so much, Heidi. So we don't really have too many questions in the chart, but the question we have is actually a $1 billion or 1 billion euros question. And the question is, I guess, it's being considered quite frequently in various various audiences. And I guess everyone has its own opinion about it. But so the question is about the potential digital deficit. So Europe finances innovation, but when it comes to creating and introducing digital platforms and services, so it seems that we in Europe are not that successful, especially as compared to the US. So in the US, we have Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, etc. Whereas in Europe, so we can say perhaps we have Spotify, maybe we have Booking.com, etc. So can we speak about some kind of digital deficit or some kind of unsuccess when it comes to Europe as compared to the US? What would you say?
Yeah, quite a difficult question to answer that. But I mean, there is some truth in that, I would say. I mean, it's obvious, that you only have to take a look and you see these big digital players, Amazon, Google, and all those other players. But Europe is also very successful in other ways. We have a very strong SME sector. I mean, SMEs drive the European economy, and there's a lot of research and innovation and innovative SMEs, and that's something that the Commission also supports. They support the development of new businesses and scaling up these success stories within Europe. So I think it's also a little bit about the differences in the structure of the economy that you have to take into account. I don't think you have to only be blinded by the Googles and Amazons of this world. There are benefits coming from digitization and digital innovations across Europe that are very, very powerful, that are not necessarily these big players. But as I mentioned, also, one of the targets of the digital decade is also to try to promote, these unicorns as they're titled sometimes. So these powerful players also in Europe, and there is this target to double the number of these unicorns that we have here. So that's not something that is not on the European Commission's radar as well.
Absolutely. And when we have a follow-up question, and actually it kind of I would say reverses perhaps the emphasis, right? So we've been thinking about those big unsuccessful platforms and what happens in Europe versus the US. But now the question is indeed when it comes to those non-digitalized SMEs. And so we've seen in the presentations during the panel discussion that quite a few of SMEs are kind of only taking the first steps. We have quite a few of them who are non-digitalized. And the essence of the question is that it seems that quite a lot of support, and it also applies to how support is channeled to European digital innovation hubs, in a way goes to what is already existing, and what is already existing also in terms of perhaps some high-tech related networks, etc. And the doubt here is whether those non-digitalized SMEs in a way are being left aside when it comes to those initiatives being financed either from the European Commission or national initiatives. So would you agree, or what would be your position, Heidi, with regard to this kind of comment as well as question?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think you can say that in the past, a lot the focus was on the very high tech and on innovation and research, whereas a lot of the programs that and projects that we are implementing now are trying to go further and try to support this, this wider digitalization of the economy, and really to scoop up the non-digitalized parts of the economy and deal with that from a policy perspective, and also from a financial perspective. So, like I said, I mean, the Digital Europe program, it is about implementation. It's about the adoption of technologies throughout the economy. So part of that, of course, is the advanced technologies, but also, I mean, spinning those out more broadly. So AI, cloud, data, big data, and all of these things, and having more supercomputers. But also, the project on the digital innovation hubs, it is there for digitizing businesses. It is there for reaching out to SMEs and to supporting them, businesses at all different stages. And a part of that, of course, is to try to focus on these SMEs that really aren't well digitalized or even have started to be digitalized at all. And then I would go back to this project that you're working on here, because exactly, again, this is the focus of the project that you're doing. It is to look at non-digitalized sectors, to look at the least digitalized parts of the economy, and to look at how we can provide them with toolboxes, with best practices and resources to support their digitalization. So the focus has shifted a lot. While we still look at the cutting edge, at unicorns, at research into advanced technologies, we're also trying to spread the digitalization benefits throughout the economy and society, and that is a big focus shift, I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yes, yes, indeed. And we'll be actually addressing partly this question during the very last presentation, when Julian Müller will be talking about good versus best practices and what's appropriate for companies who are very advanced in their digital journeys versus companies who are only starting. So I think that will be also some very pertinent evidence there. And maybe, so I see another comment in a way as well as question, and that's a very specific one. Again, the person is actually looking for some very specific support. So he represents an SME in medical device, and actually, yeah, he's looking support for some digital innovation hub or European digital innovation hub, and asks where some further information could be found, whom to contact, etc. So probably I would say that's the website of European Digital Innovation Hubs. But what would be your response here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first places to go exactly is to do a search for European Digital Innovation Hubs, and you will come to the European Commission's website, which provides a huge amount of information on the Digital Innovation Hubs project. And one of the links on that website will provide you with a map, interactive map of all the hubs in Europe, and then you can search on that map for the hub in your region or the most relevant hub. But I can. Somebody's added the link there. That's very good. So there's a link also in the chat. Yeah, and you can use this interactive map to, like I say, identify a hub and all the contact details there and everything.
Perfect. So thank you again so much for a nice and informative presentation, and also for the answers to the questions. And yeah, let's move on to the next part of our workshop, and that's the interactive part. So here we'll be asking questions and asking feedback, asking even some insights from the workshop participants. So over to you, Barbora.
Thank you, Egidijus. Thank you, Heidi, for your presentation. I see the chat is a little bit on fire, and that's always very nice to have this level of interaction in the workshop. I will try to redirect a little bit your energy now towards another tool. So once again, maybe we can meet on Mentimeter, so menti.com. And also in parallel, I encourage you, if there is a question that you think you have an answer to in the chat, you can also write directly to your colleagues or your peers in the chat to answer them as well. So, there we can have this interaction go in many different ways. But what really want to do now is to gather your feedback and gather your experiences. Like Rūta mentioned, we've been researching these digitalization best practices for SMEs through case studies, through desk research, through interviews. But like we said, the world is complex and there is no simple answer for everything. So we also want to hear what has been your experience. So join us on Mentimeter with the code 7677. 0436, and we have the first question there for you really on the principles themselves. So we presented 8 principles of digitalization, and we're curious to see which resonated with you the most. So I will share the Mentimeter also on the screen so we can all see your inputs. So maybe I can also recap quickly on what were the principles. So we spoke about the importance of sufficient managerial capacity and leadership in Principle 1. Cătălin's presentation also really touched on that, on the importance of having a vision and purpose for digitalization. Very similarly, Principle 2 is about looking at employee and third-party buying for digitalization. You cannot do the digital transformation if your company is not on board. Principle 3 was about setting strategic objectives for digitalization. So really planning and identifying your needs and understanding why you're digitalizing. Principle 4, so to speak, the usual suspect is on the skills. Similarly, Principle 5 is also on making sure that what you plan to do is feasible. So assessing your costs and, like Katrin said, very importantly, also the long-term costs and actually looking at what could be the benefits. Principle 6 is on implementation planning. So again, balancing this long-term thinking versus agility. Principle 7 is on looking at the wider ecosystem and collaboration. And finally, Principle 8 is, well, on researching your market and choosing a technology provider that actually fits your needs. And we saw also some of this touched in the panel and in the discussion. So clearly this principle is very relevant. I see now looking at the answers. 20 of you are voting for this. Similarly, the skills and cooperation is really coming through as well. But I would say, well, the difference is only a few votes. So it seems that all the principles are rather relevant for you. And that's important for us to hear as well. So maybe without further ado, I will go to the next question because I'm very, I am very curious about it. And it's about what is the most challenging one to follow. And I think maybe some of the questions in the chat touched upon this a little bit, that, well, how can we know our market if we don't really have the time? How do we secure the needs, the skills that we need? We spoke a little bit about in the panel, how to balance agility and this long-term benefits and how to make sure there are benefits in the long term. So there are quite a few challenges that can be associated with these principles. So we're quite curious to see, in your opinion, what companies might struggle with a little bit. So I'll give a little bit of time. At the same time, if you feel strongly about something, please raise your hand and we can also have a discussion. It's really a now moment for you to also comment and share your thoughts on these principles and on the broader context of this workshop. So we see the skills coming quite strongly, that skills are challenging, and it's true. We see this come up a lot and repeatedly, both in research, in events, in interviews, in case studies. Similarly, this managerial capacity seems important, and also choosing a solution and a provider that reflects your needs. Once again, I see that not everyone is on Mentimeter, so I would encourage you to connect. I dropped the link and the code in the chat. So if you have a phone or also your laptop near you, it would be great if you could join us and also share your insights. A very important point coming through in the chat. I saw, Rūta, you reacted immediately with a nod, that a problem with the skills is how to evaluate your candidates properly when you yourself don't have that skill. So, and therefore can assess it. So I understand maybe here we're also talking a little bit about the service providers, or, choosing the technology that you actually need to implement. Indeed, it's hard to know which way to go when maybe you don't have the right skills. But some of our case studies and also our previous research points to the importance of collaboration, and there is some room for digital innovation hubs, and also academia who can maybe point to some technologies that are relevant. Also clusters and associations very often have insights on potential matchmaking avenues you can go with employee that you're hiring. I agree that's also important. You should be careful and assess the skills that you need. And I think there are several assessments that can be done to really identify the gaps when it comes to this. So we have some skills, and then I see managerial capacity and choosing the provider kind of are the main challenging principles. So I will move on to the next question. And here you might need to type a little bit. And actually for the next questions as well, you might need to type, and you will need to type actually, as we go to the more subjective open questions that we're curious. So this question is about maybe potential aspects of the principles that you would like to change, or additional insights you would like to see covered in those principles. We saw some questions in the chats, about the importance of change management. Maybe it's something we can focus more in the principles. Similarly, these questions we had just now, how do you hire? That could be maybe something that's an important thing to reflect on in the future. So here, really, whatever comes to mind, really just immediately when thinking about the principles, or just anything we discussed today. I think now is the time to share it. And again, you can raise your hand and mute yourself and also contribute. And I will allow for some time for us to sit in silence in front of our screens. We have the first answer, and I think that's very important. I think it came very strongly in the panel that for this perseverance to be in place and for this long-term commitment, you need to tell, well, a good and convincing story to your company, but maybe also to yourself, to your partners and clients. Because like Irina was saying, it's not a few months project. It takes years to digitalize. And I think it's probably something you can keep on doing nonstop. We also have better explanation on digitalization to the owners of SMEs, especially in countries with low level of digital skill populations. I guess the essence here is this kind of lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, or risk aversion a little bit, like Heidi was suggesting when it came to these behavioral factors. So really communication and explanation about digitalization in the first place. So I think the first 2 points are somewhat related from different sides, but we see some relation. Interoperability, well, that's a keyword. It's a technical keyword, but it's really a keyword when it comes to implementation of technologies. And interoperability is required when you're integrating systems and maybe have some previous legacy systems that you need to approach. how to quantify and demonstrate success in a standard way. I agree. Maybe this digital maturity assessment is one way to go. Or there can also be other ways to kind of see where you fit and what's your homework that you still need to do. Again, company culture, how to really integrate the new employees with the existing culture. And there might be these tensions between highly digitalized team members and those who are maybe don't have this culture so much. Rethinking processes, connecting SMEs with tools, looking at the competences. Again, top management. They have to have insights to know what the goal should be. Good practices and success stories. Well, nice to see that we're doing something here that's important today. I like this one. Charismatic digital leadership. Do not leave it for IT, guys. I'm curious who wrote this on what was their experience with digitalization for this comment to be there. Also important to have a model for each industry and policy drivers, strategic leadership, the twin transition. That's a very important keyword these days, and I think a complex thing to implement and manage. And competition mindset. Focus on the economic benefits, indeed. So we see a lot of leadership, a lot of long-term thinking, assessing your benefits and costs. Again, this having the right skills in place. I don't know, maybe I will also allow, if anyone would like to comment or react to what's here by unmuting, my own colleagues, but also everyone else who is here.
Hey, I would like to underline what somebody said, that the change in mindset, I think, is crucial. I found it that links together with any effort done by the company. If the mindset is changed in leaders and also in employees, that's a lot of help, especially with the change management.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cătălin. So I will move on to the next question. I think we have a lot of inputs here, and now let's move on to a little bit the realities of the day. So like Heidi mentioned, right now we are facing quite an uncertain and challenging environment for SMEs, especially in Europe, given the COVID crisis that now is somewhat, I think, behind us, but still very relevant, and the recent and ongoing war in Ukraine, Russian war in Ukraine. So in your opinion, what has proved helpful, or in your experience even, what has proven helpful when digitalizing in the current uncertain and challenging environment? This might be maybe a moment for reflection that might take a bit longer, but still we're very curious to see how can SMEs navigate these challenging crises that it appears, one after the other, they keep appearing. Accept failure front, sharpen the point. If you have low expectations, it might not be a shock then. So there is also some external factors that I see being mentioned. So making sure you have the right infrastructure in place, so availability of broadband internet. Also the importance of making sure you can exchange information and data and actually track what's happening. a positive spin that actually the current uncertain and challenging environment is in itself, and it was and is a big push towards digitalization. It's actually what we also saw with our previous study when we looked at the challenges for digitalization. We saw that COVID for some companies really accelerated digitalization. For others, it actually stalled digitalization, but we did see this mixed effect. Government support. Sometimes there's just no option. If you want to survive, you have to digitalize. Very interesting that we have two opposing views on the government. We see that sometimes it's really an enabler, so there is government support helping to digitalize. On the other side is don't expect support from the government. So different experiences here when it comes to collaboration. Again, the mindset is coming through. Sharing of data and taking incremental steps that bring quick wins. So kind of really focusing on these long hanging fruits, so to speak. Communication within the company. So do not forget to inform them what are the upcoming changes. Again, really research the support that's available. Take your time to see what's out there. Having Teams meeting instead of long travel. That's probably a big enabler as well. I'm glad we could all today connect from different parts of Europe and brainstorm together. So some interesting insights here. For the sake of time and because I have a few more questions that I'm really curious about and I think that were highlighted as being important, I will move on, but if you have thoughts you want to share, you can also write them in the chat because the slide will change, but it's still very interesting for us to hear your thoughts. But really what Cătălin just mentioned and really stressed is this mindset and the importance of culture that's open to change. I just saw some also ideas, right, on, well, communicate with your employees, communicate with your colleagues, have a charismatic leader, not quote some IT guy, even though I think there's benefits for all approaches. So what practical things can SMEs, but also maybe larger companies do to build a culture that supports digitalization? So be open to feedback, indeed. Get geeks inside. I guess, right, the question that we had in the chat is how to make sure you get the right employees inside and the right people with the right skills that you need. Training on digital literacy. Communicate often and really focus on the benefits. Indeed, I think that we also see kind of recurring today that really focus on the benefits and value proposition. Create workshops on digitalization. So create the space where people can learn and be educated on this and understand what it means. And very, I think directly, there's a second comment on, well, just learn by doing. Sometimes the best way to learn is by experimenting and on the go. Again, if anyone would like to unmute and jump in, go ahead. We see the benefits come up again. And again, the short, quick wins, so you can really maybe demonstrate the benefits with these low-hanging fruits. People can be on board. So involve employees in designing the change. Ask parents to study what their kids are learning these days. So a lot of maybe gamification, a little fun input. Create concrete possible scenarios for digitalization. And lead by example, again, on this management. So a lot of pressure on management's shoulders to lead, to show quick wins, to show benefits, and to make sure everyone is well aware. if I could maybe summarize it this way. So I will move on to the next question, because I think it's really at the essence of today. And maybe I will rephrase it a bit, because we actually had two questions linked to this, but I will try to combine it into one for the sake of time. So we wanted to ask you today, what are the main components of a good digitalization strategy? But this question is really about, again, this tension of long-term planning and short-term, well, agility and just short-term operations. So what should be in place for a company to conclude that there is a digital strategy? Is it a piece of a document? Is it a joint mindset? Is it, that you did a little workshop and now everyone is informed? Cătălin was saying that at first, they had nothing. Now they have a mind map with a word perseverance on it. So it can mean a lot of different things in different situations. So we're really curious, what in your experience or your opinion, what should be there for a digitalization strategy to work and to actually be considered to be a digitalization strategy? Large vision. Think big, no? Think bigger and think long term. A portfolio of efforts. Know your goal. Document not necessary. It's just, I think, again, important that everyone is on board, like we said before. Motivation, commitment, money, will, and perseverance. That's quite a recipe. I think here's a very important point on promoting focus group sessions with experienced entrepreneurs. So again, this tapping into the broader ecosystem, maybe even into your own value chain, to see what has been done already, and looking at the risks as well. So learning from others to see how it was done, I think, is important. Understanding the market. Indeed, we saw this a lot in the panel. Very important point, realize the cost of not digitalizing. So what are you losing by not adopting the technologies? Maybe what are some of the inefficiencies, or what are the opportunities that you're foregoing from not visualizing? Yes, understand how digitalization can be interlinked to the overall business strategy. Indeed, tie those two together, tie digitalization to your own company's growth, see how that links. Understand your needs. And again, mindset. So it's not just about maybe earning money, but also about improving the workloads and value adding activities for your own employees, for your own team, but also maybe for your customers and clients. Smart objectives, indeed. And change management, again, I think another keyword. So very quickly, because we are a little bit over time, thank you for your contributions. I will jump through some questions, and I'm also very curious to ask you about the skills, as we saw skills come up as the most challenging point, maybe from the principles. So I'm curious, what is the most common way for SMEs, based on your experience, based on your research, based maybe on what you observed, to actually obtain the skills? We heard about hiring.
It's time for us to move on and to move on to the next exciting and actually also the last presentation in this workshop. So that will be by Professor Julian Müller. And he'll be speaking about the concepts of good and best practices. Is there a difference? And is there actually, does it mean once you have in mind that those concepts might potentially be different, also does it have implications for actions that SMEs could take in their digitalization journey? So Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And since I'm the last presentation, I'm the last one keeping you from lunch. So I'm trying to make this brief, but I'm still happy to connect to several points we have seen today, because I think it reflects my own observations from several projects. But jumping right in, so I have worked in several commission projects, but also published several articles in this area where some kind of clusters or some kind of ideas have been seen several times. And this is something I want to share with you today, also in connection to this question of good practice versus best practice. One start here is that many SMEs I talked to or had contact in the workshops and did interviews with is that if you talk about best practices, they're often too far away from many SMEs. The one thing we just saw in the Mentimeter was this question of low-hanging fruits, approachability, and this is something I can reflect on and have seen in many, many cases. So it's actually something I can confirm. So if you talk to SMEs, what do they hear? Build your own digital platform. Everything that can be digitized will be digitized, or something like set up your own AI system that analyzes your entire supply chain. This is all nice and true, and it's certainly a best practice on a long-term run for an SME, but it's nothing that is really approachable in the next 5 to 10 years, at least for many of the SMEs. So your own digital platform would mean that an SME is large enough to have a large set of suppliers, customers, which they actually, in many cases, don't have. So it's not really realistic for them. So the question of low-hanging fruits, approachability is one we often forget. Still, something I also see in many projects is that funding and support for SMEs often goes in the direction also politically driven. We want new things to happen. So if we help an SME, it's often not the top-notch, whatever kind of digitalization solution, but it may be something that is 5 years old for a large enterprise. It helps the SME a lot, but funding and political programs often go in a direction of like best practice, but not good practice, which are approachable to SMEs. Just to summarize, one aspect which is very important, not all SMEs are the same, which is kind of self-explanatory, but still I can't emphasize it enough, because you can see here it's a publication from colleagues of mine and me from Spanish SMEs, and we found there are actually quite different levels of digitization. So you can't put the SMEs which are more behind in the same observation or give them the same hints and programs than the leading SMEs. One thing to be discussed, and another thing, of course, is which industry sectors are they in? Where do they connect to? What is their kind of business model? Which supply chain are they active in? It completely defines on what level they are and what kind of good or best practice they need. Second insight I wanted to share with you is that if we talk about, for example, ERP system, enterprise resource planning, this is something we have not in many SMEs yet. Only 1/3 has it, whereas for large enterprise, they have it. In most cases, the same is true for robots. Many SMEs are actually cannot afford robots. It would be more than their annual turnover to buy one of those robots. So we have to kind of downgrade and downsize our best practice a little bit to a good practice to make this approachable for SMEs. So what can we actually do after this introduction? I will give you just some examples. Of course, the list is much longer, and we have already seen some examples today. But one aspect is actually that many SMEs have very good machinery, but it's not really ready for the digital world. So a huge business opportunity, but also support for them is how to make their existing production like fit for digital transformation or digital technologies in the current age. Often adding some sensors and some technologies to the machinery is enough. But on the other hand, you must keep in mind that a lot of funding, a lot of support programs are actually targeted in investing in new technologies. That's also what firms want to sell. So this is a bit of a problem here. Money, funding, venture capital, it all goes into new technologies like those nice best practices, but a best practice or a good practice is kind of a low-cost digitization. So supporting SMEs there is one key, but the other key is this term of frugal innovation. So innovation that is not like best, top-notch, but which is approachable, which is kind of low-cost, efficient. It's not what many firms want to sell to the customers, but it's what helps many SMEs. So connecting SMEs, among them others, maybe also hubs only for SMEs or parts of hubs only for SMEs, to make those technologies approachable is certainly one aspect which is very important. How to make small steps towards digitization and make their production more digitized and not buying a lot of new machinery, not affordable for most SMEs. One example which I kind of supervised myself is so-called downgraded student projects are often enough for many SMEs. So if you kind of want the top, here we see an augmented reality class in logistics processes. This is nice for research. It's also nice for many leading firms. But if you do this with older classes, which are cheaper, which are just sufficient for many cases, and if you do this with student groups, both side benefit, it's not the perfect solution, but it's good enough. It makes it more approachable. The students, it also attracts talent because they can see how it works in a company and so on. And on the other hand, it's really enough for many cases. Student projects I have seen as a good, or really not even a good, but a best practice how to integrate technologies in SMEs. It's just more approachable, it saves costs, but on the same hand, it integrates many good talents that might even start working there or at least interested in this. Further examples are that SMEs can combine their like shared interests or shared benefits. So for example, on the top left, you see tools, machinery tools, which are often like equipped with diamonds and which are very expensive, thousands of euros or even more. Many SMEs don't need them every day, but maybe once a month or even less than that. So really innovative solutions how to share the tools are very easy to do with current technologies, but it's something we haven't seen that much so far. Of course, there are some providers who do it, but if you do this sharing of tools, of also capacities for tools, for machineries, this is certainly one way to do it. On the top right, I was just talking about capacities. You don't need like a perfect IT expert for any SME, but it makes sense if you have an expert on server, on remote maintenance or whatever, IT infrastructure, if there are ways to share it, and there are good examples to do this. So we don't need a perfect solution which is custom and like nice to show everyone, but we need one that works and which is approachable to each and everyone. So in the end, the idea here is that the companies can interconnect across the different fields and that they are kind of putting their common interests together and saving a lot of cost. It won't be the perfect tailored solution for each and everyone, but it will be good enough in many cases. Same with talent acquisition. If SMEs like to cooperate among equals, among firms which are not driven by investors, but which are driven by common values, common negotiation power, common size. So like doing it together to attract talent, also in the student project. It's also a good way. And finally, one thing we saw as in the gap analysis last time is broadband internet access. If there is an SME in a remote location, in many cases, the problem is it's not really approachable for them to get broadband internet access because one, SME is just too small to afford it. The internet providers are not interested in it. But if many SMEs or several SMEs, like an industrial park or whatever, if they come and jointly say, we need this, then it can work. So putting this together makes sense in the end. So to summarize, good is often better for SMEs than best to make practices approachable. So small steps, making retrofitting of existing machinery, talking how to do it on a low-cost way and not on a way which is good for marketing purposes or political programs who want to highlight that they're like leading. The second one is what might be outdated for large firms is still good enough for many SMEs, but it doesn't attract funding or interest on the market. Still, it's good enough to bring them there. And third, nevertheless, the long-term goal should not be forgotten. So small steps, low-hanging fruits are interesting and are the right way for many SMEs, but some SMEs which are leading, which offer a certain technology, they still need to consider moving right into like the best practices, the leading technology. So I don't want to say for each and every SME, top technology is not the right one, but for many of them, it's actually a way to get there. So long story short, we need like good practices for SMEs, which they feel connected to, which make them approachable for them, and not only like the technology which is nice for marketing, nice for attracting investment, nice for highlighting it in political programs, but we need something more approachable, so good, not only bad in this regard. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So thank you so much for this insightful presentation. Apparently, at the moment, we don't really have too many questions in the chat. So there is a question about the actual data that you've been using. So so if someone wants to actually access the source, the data source about the robots, for example, so what would be the actual source?
It was from the German Robot Association but I can still share it with you, so you can share it afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so are there any other questions? Because I don't really see any on my side. I would actually have one question, and the interesting thing for me is, so what would you say, Julian, in practice, to what extent would you observe this understanding that companies kind of pursue this idea that for most SMEs, those good practices are good enough, and they don't really need to chase for those best practices, versus to what extent you would say that there are still like too many companies which get into this trap of thinking about and pursuing those most expensive best technologies?
That's a very good question. Thank you. I think there is a change in mindset happening at the moment, at least for some firms. It's hard to get a real percentage, but like some years ago, we were going into this direction of we want to have everything digitized and fastest way possible and with top technologies. But especially if you ask like in logistics or in production departments that need to connect with suppliers, especially SME suppliers, they're going into the direction of how can we do this stepwise and how can we actually do something that's approachable. So if we go more into like logistics and production, I think it's getting more and more realistic, so to speak. But of course, if you talk about strategy and if you talk about what is shown to the board or to the press or whatever, it's not this what is shown. But actually many SMEs would demand, especially for like funded programs, please put your money more into the firms who don't get support so far, and not only in the top technology examples.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot for the answer. And well, if there are no further questions, I guess we can switch towards the concluding statements. And so actually, so there is a comment about what happens to the project report, etc. So obviously, we'll make it available. It's indeed about our next steps. So indeed, we are going to share the workshop presentations. We'll also reflect on the feedback we received, ideas we received during this workshop. We'll integrate them into our best practices report. We'll also be exploring further the best practices or good practices in digitalization through actually real life examples. Five experiments we'll be contributing to in real companies. And then there will be a follow-up workshop. We'll be presenting our findings and our experiences in April 2023. And actually, before we finish, so here's time to get on the Mentimeter one more time. And there's still one question we'd like to ask everyone today. So please take your phones and get on the Mentimeter again. Yeah, so go ahead, Barbora.
Sorry, just wanted to kind of give some context. So this question is more for us and also more for you, maybe to digest a little bit, or just to think. I'm thinking in these terms because I think lunch is very close. So to reflect a bit about what we were discussing today and how you feel and what you think you will take away from today's discussion. Maybe you are just very hungry, and that's also fine. You can also mention that. So please share your reflections at the end of the day, at the end of this workshop, on your way out. And thank you very much for joining us. And like mentioned by Egidijus, we will publish the presentations that were shared today, also the Julian report that he mentioned. And those of you who registered, you will all receive an email with these materials. They will be available online after the workshop.
So some inputs are still coming in.
Yeah.
We see somehow symbolically that the word ecosystem stands out and stands out in the center.
Indeed, on collaboration. But Egidijus, I think we can wrap up. I think we can leave the slide for people to reflect. And thank you all for coming. Please,
Absolutely.
if you still have time, you can share your thoughts. But otherwise, we wish you a nice lunch. And we also hope to see you in our next events, as there will be more phases of the study and more results that we plan to share with all of you. And thank you very much for speakers.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks a lot to you, Barbora, too. Yeah, nice workshop we had today, and very much looking forward to meet everyone in our further events.